Hello again. This is Dr. Frank Miller coming to you from Western North Carolina on the Mental Health Reform National Podcast. I apologize for the last 2 months' hiatus and absence. Unfortunately, I have chronic multiple myeloma and had to undergo a trial of several different medicines to switch over, change my regimen on an elective basis. I don't have any danger of dying or anything. Mine has proven to be manageable, and although I have a few complications, like I might break a bone if I fall the wrong way and hit concrete, it's turned into, like usual for most people with myeloma these days, the last 10 years, a chronic medical illness. So I've had a real live reason for this hiatus, and I sincerely apologize for it. It is not my intention to do so, because I want to keep getting this podcast out on twice a month basis. I have been able to keep up my entries in my online WordPress.org blog, Mental Health Reform blog, and personal blog, penandpsychiatrist.com on WordPress.org. So if you're interested in sort of catching up on some developments I've kept up with pretty reliably, since I can do that from a sitting position, and it's easier to do that than to do this. So I've tried to keep my hand in while I was fiddling around with my myeloma. In any case, last several episodes, I have continued to focus on the enormous role that state hospitals have played in mental health care in this country, especially in the early days up until approximately the 1950s. Today, I want to sort of try to close that out in a sense, although with current developments all over the country, still in the state hospital sector and what to do. But coming developments seem to be in the outpatient sector, and finally complying with the Olmsted Act, that's spelled Olmsted, Supreme Court decision, and a good one of several years ago that is helping to speed along the transition from inpatient to outpatient services wherever and whenever possible. But after this episode, I hope that we'll be able to focus on current and present and future developments in the revolution in the delivery of the mental health care services in this country pretty much from now on. But I want to give you an overall history of psychiatry. In the old days, and I mean in the Middle Ages, back in year 1000 and even before, but certainly during the Middle Ages, people with mental illness were regarded as bewitched, possessed, demonized, etc., and were burned at the stake, tortured, killed, at the least were shunned and shut out of communities and left to live on their own alone, or virtually held captive in their own communities, kind of shut away. And some of the famous Southern American literature authors of the first half of the 1900s always had a character, it seemed. Aunt Edna closed away up in the turret of the Southern New Tara mansion, because she was mentally disturbed and nobody talked about her, and they kept her up there, and apparently the mentally ill in those days were happy to comply or something. But there was a common figure in American literature depicting the plight of the mentally ill and the wealthy. In the rest of the world, of the mentally ill in the Western world, people were shut away in pre-institutions. Beginning in the 1700s, however, the Quakers in Pennsylvania began to start humane housing and institutions, if you will, places where mentally ill could be gathered and cared for by the Quaker communities, and several of them were started virtually within the same 20 years or so. And the Quakers were responsible for housing and treating the mentally ill for the first time in this country. The first state hospital is reputedly still to have been Eastern State Hospital in Williamsburg, Virginia, which is, by the way, still functioning and still a very good institution, one I visited many years ago to collaborate with another psychiatrist on a modest clinical study. But beginning in the early 1800s, largely due to the efforts of Dorothea Dix, who died in 1881, and who spent her life beginning literally at age 19 or 21, I'm not quite sure, traveling the southeast, middle Atlantic states and northeast, advocating for the mentally ill before and after the Civil War years, right up until her death in 1881, advocating for more humane treatment, taking the mentally ill out of jail-like settings, torture houses, I would call them, almshouses, and just dreadful, horrible, miserable conditions, worse than jails of the times, and instituting what they later began to call moral treatment, humane treatment. And beginning in the 1840s, some of the states started to heed her call and build buildings, facilities, care facilities with staff and with all the usual accoutrements, dining halls, medical clinics, lawns, that sort of thing. Then the movement really took off in the 1870s. An architect named Kirkenbride is responsible for the architecture of most of the state hospitals in this country. And he had a particularly distinctive system of architecture, which involved several-story brick buildings, but they were cantilevered. You'd have the front of the building with a main lobby where the administrative offices and visitors and all that were housed. And then off that, in each direction, right and left, would be the start of wings perpendicular to the lobby building. And they would go for a certain distance, and then they would have an extension that would go backwards. And then, perpendicular to that, going out in the same direction as the first wing would be another wing, and then another backwards extension, and then off to either side on these long, elongated wings would be more wards, so that these buildings were huge. And they were incredibly well built. Most of them had no wood in them whatsoever. Their walls were built out of steel, concrete, and handmade brick. And that's why they've lasted so long from the 1870s to the 1920s, when all of them were built. My own hospital, where I built, was built in 1875. And the thing has walls 2.5 feet thick. And I think if we were hit by a North Korean missile, we'd be in pretty good shape, better than most places. They're a little bit hard to bring up to code, though. You have to drill through these walls to put through new electrical conduits or air conditioning shafts or things like that. And that is made for the problems that most states face. These buildings in some ways are almost indestructible. But the insides are deteriorating. They're not up to code. They've had to sort of put in add-on wiring that's not up to building code, do all these sort of paste-on modifications, and keeping these places up to maintenance, with a lot of them having old-fashioned slate roofs that were almost indestructible for years, but now they're broken, they're leaking. Walls in these places were in great shape, but the windows often were 8 to 12 feet high. Ceilings are routinely 14 feet high. Well, you can't get 8 feet high windows anymore, so that poses a problem. So, in addition to the movement of deinstitutionalization, which began in the 1950s and accelerated in the 1960s with two developments. First was the era of modern psychopharmacology, which came along in the late 1950s with the advent of two medicines, Elavil for depression, amitriptyline by its generic name now, and Thorazine, the first antipsychotic, or chlorpromazine, was able to treat, emancipate, and release back to their homes and livings approximately half or more of the state hospital patients that in the era before psychopharmacology were relegated to a lifelong existence in the institutions. Now, a psychologist named Goffman wrote a book called Institutionalization in the 1950s and toured state hospitals as a matter of study and saw all the chronic schizophrenics who were in dreadful shape symptomatically and clinically. And this was in the era just before the advent of medicines and just a little bit afterwards. And he came out with a book that really seized the imagination and, of course, the mind of every gullible college student. And I was one of them, too, so I'll speak with impunity about how bad state hospital institutions were. And they were, in many senses. In many senses, though, they were great institutions. The one where I work has 7,400 acres of land, literally two separate farm sites. It has a pond. It has everything. Underground tunnels to permit the transportation of foodstuffs and harvests from the fields at great distances, from the home-based hospital, even up to 2.5 miles underground some of these tunnels were for in the winter during the snow months, especially in the Northeast and upper Midwest. So these were self-sufficient farms, almost kibbutzim in my view, since I spent some time on a kibbutz in Israel as a teenager. They were self-sufficient communities that raised sheep, cattle, pig, chickens, got eggs, all kinds of grains, wheat, alfalfa, cotton, you name it. They raised it and they used it in a completely self-sufficient way off the grid. They fashioned their own steam and wood and natural gas, kerosene-based fuel supplies when those came along in the early 1900s. Before that, they used wood furnaces with steam and water pipes, heating systems, and you name it. So they furnished good shelter, food, nutrition. In the warm months, patients were able to go out and work on these farm-like settings, and they had inside industries. And here's a real knocker for everybody. In those days, the discharge rate was 50%. In these days, the discharge rate from state hospitals is 50%. Somehow we haven't improved. One of the things that we've done, and I'm a card-carrying member of this organization, as I believe in most of its endeavors to preserve our civil rights, no matter what the cost,